Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft, and welcome back to more modelling for beginners and page 2 of the instruction booklet. Here we are. So now construction has shifted course to the radiator housing and duct assembly. So I have the parts here, and it's a simple enough assembly, but there's more parts in there than I've ever seen in a Mustang kit so far, certainly at this scale. So let's have a quick look at the parts. I have already trimmed them off the frames. I don't think there's too much value in continually showing everybody how to do that. The important thing really with the main parts here is that when cleaning up the parts, the sprue nubs on this area here are cleaned down properly, because this area interacts with this little lid part here. So if the sprue stub isn't cleaned off properly, then this lid part won't fit properly. And it's quite a neat little assembly. The way it's together, these three parts produce the radiator duct. Clearly it is not a seamless radiator duct, and everyone's mileage is going to vary on that. There are also a couple of ejector pin marks in each side of these parts, and again some may wish to clean those up a little bit, bearing in mind that this entire area will be painted with a silver paint. All of these imperfections have the best possible opportunity to show up. Same deal at the back here. The exhaust end has got some fairly prominent ejector pin circles as well, and depending on where you plan to model the exit duct flap, they will be fairly obvious. Here's that Meng Mustang again, and I've got the flap open on this one, and I know the light's not going to play ball, but you can see in there quite well with your eyes, and I can clearly see, for instance, the ejector pin marks on the inside of the flap. However, if that were modelled closed, as it is in flight for the most part, then you're not going to be able to see inside there very well. You will be able to see in there, but not very well. On top of that, the outside, so this is it's kind of confusing to figure it out. This is the lower part of the duct with its little strakes moulded in. This part forms the top of the oil cooler exhaust duct. So we've got the oil cooler and radiator in this assembly stacked up. So this slot here forms the exit area for the oil cooler ducting, and this, the reverse side of this piece, is in fact what forms that. And again, there's a fairly visible ejector pin mark sat there. Radiator and oil cooler faces themselves are nicely done, perfectly adequate, but obviously these parts do need a little bit of cleanup if you want to do the ejector pin marks and indeed the seam, and I think I will, just to show it being done. So I've removed the ejector pin marks from these side faces with the number 15 blade simply by gently scraping. If you scrape gently enough, it doesn't leave horrible marks and striations, which are then just as obvious as the damage was in the first place. And this is far from perfect. If this were in plain view, it would look terrible, but it's down the duct, and I've successfully removed the sharp edges that just would have picked up so sharply with that metallic paint on them. And then I started to look at the ones here. Now these will be much more visible on the finished model if you choose to have the flap open, and even potentially if you have it closed. So obviously these pins are in the way of cleaning that up nicely, so I flipped forwarded through the instructions, and it's always a good idea to do this anyway. A note here at step 41 that actually you need to remove one of the pins if you're having it open, and both if you're having it closed. So I'm going for a closed vent, so I'm going to now remove both of these pins to enable me to fill and sand these successfully. Now I have some super glue and talc filler in both of those ejector pin marks, and I realise that's kind of hard to see because I didn't put any pigment in it, and I'm going to use the endlessly useful number 15 blade to carefully, oh so carefully, trim, slice, pare, however you want to look at it, basically carve most of this super glue and talc filler away. Get it pretty much flush with the surface. It's quite easy to do. Well, not in the middle there. You can probably see from the shavings that come away, I'm not using a lot of pressure here. Noisy. Then use a suitable sanding stick of your choice. The skinny sanders are dead handy in these situations. Come in there and just gently sand off, or sand smooth or sand flat, however you want to look at it, the marks that have been left by the carving process. But I'm hoping it's obvious by the speed at which I have just carried that out that the carving part did save a lot of time. I will repeat that 3 more times and I'll be back. Right then, these are sanded down, all gone, done, nice and smooth. That is not going to show a flaw now when it's assembled. And I thought I'd just take a moment to show how all of these parts interact together within the fuselage, because it's quite clever how Airfix have done this, and none of this is glued in, so so you can see how the side piece of the duct interacts with the fuselage there and leaves that join, and the rest of it all just sits in place. And it's quite neat too at the back here when it's in properly. It's pretty neat. And then the whole assembly joints with the sort of cockpit area piece there, and it's all quite neat and tidy. So the only part really that leaves a seam or a join is going to be this part here, which is the roof of the duct, effectively. So if I put the other half on that, so that area there, it will be impossible to see that when everything's fitted, so I'm not going to worry about it from this point on. Bearing in mind of what as well, that if I just trap that there in place, there we go. Bear in mind also that there's another sort of an inlet lip to go on the front of this. You can see in there, but really not to any great degree, so don't worry too much about the seams. I think it's probably just about worth cleaning up those ejector pins just in case they catch the light. Definitely worth cleaning this one up. That was done with the 15 blade as well, scraped away. Definitely worth doing that. And likewise these side ones, especially if you're going to go with the open flap. So at this point then, some paint needs to go into these areas. And the order in which that's done and the degree of detail to which you carry that out, again, is going to be a very personal thing. Now you can't assemble this part together like this without first trapping putting the radiator in situ. It won't go in afterwards unless you cut a slot into these areas here, which would then leave a noticeable gap when the whole thing's complete. So I'm going to glue it in place and then paint the thing like this. The rear face of the radiator does slot down, it just posts down into position with it together, so that doesn't necessarily have to be in situ right now. And obviously if you fit this area here, you're going to really struggle to get paint in there anyway, so you can glue these pieces together. I did find with the radiator that with this front face of the radiator core, I needed to thin this area, the top and the bottom, to get it into a place where this part, the roof of the duct, would fit snugly into position. So do bear that in mind. Just scraped and sanded and thinned it down until it all fitted together nicely. And that is that glued together. Likewise, there's not really any benefit to be had from not fitting the oil cooler face into its position here. And then just add in the liquid glue from the back. Like so. So Airfix just recommend an aluminium colour. Obviously they do differentiate with and say to use a gunmetal colour for the radiator faces themselves. I'm going to spray the whole thing though with Tamiya's LP11 silver. This is a colour that I really do like this for anywhere that needs to be silver. And that's these parts painted silver. Now bear in mind that some of this probably won't be the actual completely final finish, but you do need the paint in here because it will be hard to get it in later. And obviously I did put just a little bit of masking over these previously painted parts just to save any little sparkly bits of overspray. Obviously sprayed all the other parts as well, and now I need to put a very, very unsubtle wash on these faces. This is the Tamiya black enamel wash, but any black wash will do, or if you want to be more subtle, use a dark grey. Just paint it on the whole thing, and by painting it on the whole thing it just tips that silver colour back a bit as well, so it makes it look like the radiator is a different silver than the rest of it. And I've already done these, so once the wash is dry, because I'm not going to bother trying to get any of it out, I don't want any of it to come out, I want it to stay like that. Once it's dry, if you wish for your model, you can give it a buff with a cotton bud and it'll take some of it off the raised areas, or even a little dry brush back with some more silver or gunmetal if you want to just pick it out even more. Of course that is an option. And there it is, all fitted together and fixed into place. So it butts up onto these little shelves moulded in the bottom here, and then it joins all the way along there and down to the back. Nice secure positive joining mechanism there. And as usual the lights aren't really helping me here, but there it all is. No big ejector pin mark circles anywhere. Now whilst I was in there, I have also painted the various little areas of the inside of the fuselage that will need to be covered. There we go, it just clips into position. I've gone off camera, sorry. Very, very neat reproduction of the actually quite complex radiator duct assembly in the P-51. And when that's all held together, the rear face of the main radiator core is quite easily visible down there, and when you look down the front, what you can actually see is the oil cooler, the radiator sort of further up and back in there. It's just vaguely visible. So I think any further effort in mitigating any of those seams would have genuinely been wasted effort. So, with that out of the way, the next part of the instructions here on page 2 brings us back to the tail wheel bay and the tail wheel itself, the strut more precisely. So I'll just remove this core from the fuselage again. And now we need to add sides to this area here, which are these parts. And note on the instructions we're shown that if we wish to build the model with the undercarriage retracted, we in fact have to cut the doors off. They are integrally moulded onto these parts. We do again have some naughty ejector pin marks in there, but I'm going to completely ignore them because I really don't think they'll be visible. And we also need to trap or position the actual tail wheel strut in place before joining even both of the sides on the tail wheel bay. So we're going to break out that Resin wheel set in a second, but before we get on with that, we're obviously going to have to paint these areas with that interior green mix, and indeed paint the tail strut. So just a quick flick at the very absolutely next step of the instruction shows that we're going to go back and start working with the cockpit sidewalls. So in order to save a little bit of time and effort, I have already clipped those parts off as well, and we'll prepare those so that I can paint the base colour on at the same time that I do the tail wheel or the tail wheel base sides. So as part of that preparation, again we've got some really intrusive ejector pin marks on these parts here. These two are relatively easy to get at to clean up. However, on this side, there's one right here which would be an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to show a slightly different way of mitigating an ejector pin mark for this one. Since it's necessary to trap this tail wheel leg into these parts as we assemble it, I have got the Resin one out, so I'm going to just show you a comparison of the two. This is the kit part here, and it's not bad at all. In fairness, you can see it's got the tail wheel itself moulded in, but not the tyre. And then this is the Resin part. It's not a night and day difference, it's just crisper, sharper, the detail. It's a tiny few bits here and there extra, but there really isn't a lot in it. Now this is a resin part, but it's no different in reality treating it to remove it from this than any plastic part really. So I've got my nippers and I'm going to cut it all the way from the base here, just gently till it's through like so. I'm going to do the same coming back from this way. And that's got it off the casting block. But clearly quite a bit of cleanup to do. But again, now that the block is out of the way, I can just nibble away at this casting frame bit by bit. It's best not to try and do it all in one go. Because you could very easily end up snapping the part and then you're stuck with the kit part anyway. Some people may have reservations about using a resin undercarriage leg. I have some myself, to be fair, but it's not bearing an enormous amount of load, and in reality the plastic one is quite flexible as well. But as I say, this is not a night and day difference, and Much of it won't be visible when the model is complete, but clearly the slightly better wheel itself is quite visible, but the legs not so much. So once you've got most of that excess off, it's just simply a case of using your sharp blade the way you would with anything else. Just go around and gently trim off the casting stub. I am now at the point where I can pretty much start to get some paint on these parts, and I did promise to show an easy way to fix this naughty little ejector mark there. Put that the right way up, just by that trim wheel. As it's fairly obvious, it's going to be pretty awkward to get in there and fill it. The other ones I filled with super glue and talc. I've scraped them with my number 15 blade. I scraped and trimmed them to the point where they are pretty much there, and then finished off with a skinny sander, which I've made skinnier still by simply trimming it down with the nippers so that it fits between the frames and just give that a little tickle. So, cheating time. What I've done, a little piece of Tamiya tape, and I've cut and trimmed it to fit in here between the frames and around that housing. And just pop that into position, and don't press it down too firmly because you don't want it to conform to the ejector pin mark. And I feel like I've said ejector pin mark 9,000 times in this video, and there you go, it's gone, it's hidden. No, it's not accurate, you know, but it'll barely be noticeable, and certainly less noticeable I think than the ejector pin itself. If you really wanted to you know, do a super nice job, you could trim so that it fits all the way up here around this trim wheel or whatever it is, so there's no line there. But you know, that took, oh, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds to do, and it's sorted. Note also that I have removed some of the detail from certain areas in accordance with the diagram here to allow the fitment of the 3D decals after paint. And just one quick other thing to mention is the fit of this sub-assembly into the fuselage halves. Now, which way around are we? Yeah, that's the good one. Okay. So this is the right hand fuselage half, and when I introduce this assembly into it and looking at the bottom, it doesn't naturally sit with this piece flush. If you listen, when I squeeze it, there's a little creak, and that creaking sound is this plastic telling us that something's interfering. There's some chafing going on in there leading to that creak. So ideally, to get a good fit, because if I bring the other half, fuselage half, into play, again, naturally it doesn't, it will squeeze together with some pressure, but it's better if it will sit together as that creak again without too much pressure. So how do we find out where the creak's coming from and what it is that's interfering? You can get a good idea by looking at the shape of the parts and figuring out what's going to be going where, but because I've painted these internal areas with silver paint, it's actually very easy to see where the issue is, because the chafe marks on the paint, I can see it with my eyes. Whether it's going to come out on video is another thing. The chafe marks on the paint turn the silver paint a slightly different colour. It goes a little darker, and just back here you may be able to see evidence of that. And indeed, just on this back edge here of the rear face of the radiator, you can see it's sort of polished smooth, and that's where it's touching on the inside. So that's the area specifically here and here where I'm just going to trim and sand just a touch of that away, just to help that all fit together. And the other point to note is the sidewall for this rear bay. If you glue it in place beforehand like this, be careful to make sure that you don't push this in too far, because when fitted, or not far enough to be fair, when fitted the door needs to line up with the aperture for the fuselage. So what I did with this side is I just glued the part to the fuselage. Perfect fit of the door, no worries about alignment, and indeed when the pieces are put together it fits just fine. Well, it doesn't, but we'll talk about that later. Well, here it is painted, and I followed exactly the same steps as I previously followed with the cockpit area. I painted our self-made Tamiya interior green mix into these areas. I put a coat of X22 on it, left that to dry, and then I used the exact same wash again. This was the AK Wash Aircraft Engine AK2033, which is basically just a dark brown, in exactly the same way as I detailed here, and here are the results. So this is the one that was fitted to the fuselage, and then the rest of the tail bay as is there. I have fitted the tail wheel strut, so this is designed to plug into the sidewalls with these posts here either side and then go through the top. Now I found in both the case of this aftermarket strut and the kit strut that top peg doesn't actually reach all the way to the roof and go through the top of there, and I'll just show on the instructions so I'm not misunderstanding things here. The pegs go into the hole there and the strut up through the top. As I say, neither the kit or the aftermarket part actually reach all the way through, but it's just tickling the hole, so I put super glue in from the top just to hold that in place, and then I placed it into the socket there and then closed the fuselage halves around it to ensure alignment, and that's now dry and good to go. This was also washed and everything else in the same way as the rest of it. So, oh, and painting the green, obviously I masked off the area that I'd already painted silver, but be aware that the sidewalls don't cover the entirety of the area that needs to be green when you fit the rest of the cockpit, so make sure and paint forward some and all the way back to this moulded in location line there. So that brings us to the end of episode 3 and the end of page 2 in the instructions. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful. Thanks as always for all of your support and all of the ways that you show it. And I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. And with all of that said, I think it only remains for me to say until next time, look after yourselves, look after each other, and Genesis out.